I'm just going to introduce really briefly Slavs and Tatars. It's a faction of polemics and intimacies devoted to an area east of the former Berlin Wall and west of the Great Wall of China, known as Eurasia. The collective's practice is based on 3 activities: exhibitions, books, and lecture performances. Please welcome warmly Slavs and Tatars.
Thank you, Anne. And I don't know if this is working. Can you hear me? Yes. Yeah. This lecture performance started as an itch at the back of the throat, like many of our projects. And this itch that we're discussing today is called transliteration. And transliteration is, in some sense, the younger, trashier sibling to translation, right? Translation is noble. Departments are devoted to it. Very famous authors are noted for it. Nabokov, Baudelaire, Edgar Allan Poe. Transliteration is the kind of unworthy, transactional younger sibling, in the sense that transliteration is transactional. It's the change of script within one language from one alphabet to another. And of course, it poses certain questions having to do with reading. We started out as a book club, kind of informal book club, halfway between, I guess, Oprah Winfrey and Attila the Hun, where we published books or published material, translated material that was no longer available in English, and distributed amongst our friends. In the past decade now, we've published about 8 books. These are some of the books, or maybe all of the books. But our books are not catalogs, and I think it's important to emphasize this because we don't allow anybody to write about us in our books. It's not because we're control freaks, but because we think that catalogs are in some sense kind of the equivalent of insider trading in the art world. What happens, as you know, is that you invite a famous critic or curator to write about you. This critic or curator makes you look good, and you make them look good because you're an emerging artist. So it should be illegal, essentially. Any industry would be illegal. But in art, it's kind of normal, either because I guess artists don't write themselves, but actually we think that it's healthy to do our utmost to support kind of ethically certain firewalls between certain professions. So in that sense, if somebody wants to write about us, they should do so within an art newspaper, an art magazine, as a critic, and not. Sorry, carry on. Hold on. Is that better? Yeah. And not within the pages of our own publication, because if I invite you as a critic, you're not going to really be objective, right? You're not when you invite somebody to your house, they don't come and complain about the dinner that you cook. So there's a kind of conflict of interest. Our books, like our lecture performances, they act as sort of further platforms of research to delve into certain topics that we're interested in, and so part of this, of course, is looking back at history and resuscitating history. Now, the resuscitation of history is something which is a specific word, resuscitation, because it implies a certain urgency, right? It's different when you put your lips onto the lips of history and you breathe into it. First of all, it implies a affective approach to the material as opposed to an analytical, positivist, kind of rational approach. But also, it has to do with a kind of an emergency. it's different than when you put your lips on somebody's lips for a French kiss, right? The person whom you're resuscitating didn't ask you to lock lips with them. And this breathing into history is important because it allows us to posit an anti-modernist stance. And this anti-modernism is something which is a perspective that our hero and kind of mascot, a 12th century figure called Mullen Nasruddin. I don't know if you're familiar with Mullen Nasruddin. Mullen Nasruddin is a kind of 12th century wise man come fool, Sufi, kind of court jester in some sense. He did exist somewhere in Anatolia. And everywhere there were Muslims, historically, from Croatia to China, all the way down to Sudan, there was a version of Mullen Nasruddin. Parents would tell their children stories of Mullen Nasruddin, Nasruddin Khoja. He's also called Afanti Nasruddin in China. And they would tell stories of Mullen Nasruddin in a similar way, I guess, that we would be told stories of like Brothers Grimm fairy tales that have elements of morality and ethics into them, or La Fontaine's fables. So a typical Mullen Nasruddin story, for example, is there's somebody on one side of the river yelling to Mullen Nasruddin, how do I get to the other side of the river? And he answers, you are on the other side of the river. It's like this very first degree stupid sense of humor that allows for other elements of sort of relativism, morality, perspective. So in some sense, he's a kind of proto-Ali G or Borat, right? Really revealing kind of the stupidity of others, or kind of critique, through this first degree sense of humor. And this anti-modernism, we borrow this term from Antoine Compagnon, who was a professor of philosophy at the Collège de France and Columbia University. He has a book called, I don't know if I have it here. No, I don't. He has a book here called Les Anti-Modernes, where he basically defines the true modernist as not the person as not the kind of Mayakovskis, the Marinettis that are gung-ho on sort of futurology and how the utopia is going to come with industrial age and the machine age. He actually defines the true modernist in 19th century French literature, from Péguy to Chateaubriand, all the way to sort of Baudelaire and Barthes even. He says the true modernists are those people who are marching into the future, but with an eye in the rearview mirror. So facing the past, but moving into the future. And this is the way, of course, that Sartre described Baudelaire as driving into the future, but with an eye on the rearview mirror. Or Benjamin's Angel of History is, of course, propelled into the future, but sort of facing the rubble of the past and present. Now, the languages that I speak, unfortunately, are Indo-European. So in those languages, if you think about the way we even spatially present future and past, it shows to what extent our thought processes are positivist, right? The future is ahead of us because we imagine we know where we're going, and the past is behind us because that implies that it's irrelevant. Now, in the Malgache language in Madagascar, they've reversed it, or it's the opposite, meaning that in Malgache, the past is represented as being in front of you, and the future is being behind you, which I think is much more accurate, a way to describe time. As I mentioned, Mullen Nasruddin is often depicted backwards on his donkey, riding backwards on his donkey. And another favorite Nasruddin quote, sort of anecdote of mine is, they ask Mullen Nasruddin, why are you always riding backwards on your donkey? And he answers, well, it makes no sense for both of us to look in the same direction. And not here for the Guangzhou Biennale, we actually, through this very simple gesture of having somebody ride backwards on their donkey, it was also an attempt to present different iconography, I guess, or different heroes. I mean, there's no reason why the rides outside of supermarkets in Poland should have cowboys and Indians, right? I mean, it has no resonance with the local culture. And here, just by the very fact that children would have to hold the belly. Now, this kid actually figured it out, so she also faces backwards. But normally the child would ride facing the old man and have to hold the belly. And of course, it creates a kind of awkward situation where the child asks the parents, why am I holding an old man's belly, right? And then all these difficult questions, these kind of complex questions of perspective, of time, of progress, of history, have to be imparted to a 4 or 5-year-old, not in a dissimilar way to Mullen Nasruddin's kind of distillations of these issues. Now, this attempt to bring together two kind of mutually exclusive, antithetical thoughts, registers, voices into one page, into one register, into one voice, is something that we call the metaphysical splits. So it's not the splits of the legs, but the splits of the mind. In English, there's a lot of, actually half of these are Latin, I guess. Yeah. There's a lot of terms for this idea, like cognitive dissonance or amphiboly, two contradictory statements within one statement. For us, it's this idea, even in our bio that Anne mentioned, our remit, our geographic remit, is between the former Berlin Wall and the Great Wall of China. These are two walls that you normally don't put together. We're not the only ones who do so. People like Olivier Roy, the French philosopher, or French sort of a specialist of political Islam. But even bringing these two walls, or the two geopolitical narratives that go with these walls, meaning communism and political Islam, is something that we've been sort of obsessed with and trying to really kind of force into one page, one voice, and one register. And we did this. This is, I guess, an example of that. I don't have to translate this, but this is a term. This aphorism, "Dig the booty of monoglots, but marry my child a polyglot," essentially means that if you want to have a one-night stand, or excuse my French, fuck around, do so with somebody who speaks one language. But if you're going to settle down and sort of get serious, then do so with somebody who speaks more than one language. Now, people who start their phrases with "dig the booty" don't normally end it with monoglot and polyglot, right? It's kind of two different registers of language. One is the language of the street. The other one is maybe the language of the academy, or a bit more erudite language. And what we've done is we've transliterated it. So it's not translated, but you can see anybody who reads or writes Cyrillic, dig the booty of monoglots, bat, there's no in Russian, so bat, marry my child, and similarly in Arab, in Perso-Arabic script here. Because if you read or write a non-Latin based language, transliteration is something you're doing on a daily basis. I mean, when I write an email to my Russian friends, I don't do so. I don't learn the Cyrillic alphabet, the QWERTY of Cyrillic. I just write it in what you call like Pinglish, I guess. In Persian, you write in English, sort of Latin letters. Now, for our exhibition at the Secession in Vienna, it was called Not Moscow, Not Mecca, and we looked at the issue of the syncretism of Islam in Central Asia, and namely Mazar culture. But when we were doing the research for this exhibition, and these fruits are actually part of the installation, these watermelons outside. Normally, you don't put Marx and Muhammad together in one phrase, right? One is the darling of the left, probably many students here as well. The other one is a darling of the so-called right, meaning like Muhammad is considered to be somehow conservative. If you're, and we're not the only people who put Islam and communism together in a kind of geopolitical context. In fact, as I mentioned, Olivier Roy was doing this in the 90s. But also, interestingly enough, this gentleman on the left, Norman Brown, was a specialist of Blake. He was a comparative literature professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz. And he was a kind of hero of the counterculture, kind of flower power 60s, 70s hippie movement. He never was like experimenting in drugs like his followers, but he basically did a book where he psychoanalyzed the whole of history. And in the latter years of his life, the last decade of his life, he died in 2002, he devoted himself to reading the Quran. And he did so not because he converted to Islam. He remained, I think, a Presbyterian or Methodist throughout his life. But he did so because he believed that it was a proto-modernist text, meaning that until the Quran was translated into English, until he basically said that until James Joyce was published, we wouldn't understand the holy book of Islam because we didn't understand how it was structured. If you think about the Old Testament and the New Testament, time is linear. Sort of A leads to B leads to C. Time in the Quran is circular and cyclical. Characters in the Old Testament and New Testament remain the same. Hagar is Hagar, Jesus is Jesus. In the Quran, the characters, it's almost like that scene in Lost Highway where you pull out of David Lynch's film, where you pull out of, and all of a sudden, I think it's Jeff Daniels or Bill Pullman becomes Balthazar Getty. You know, Hagar suddenly wakes up one day and he's Joseph, and Joseph wakes up one day and he's Muhammad. Muhammad wakes up one day and he's Jesus. So there's a non-teleological approach to Islam as well, and he goes on to identify 110 of the 114 chapter headings of the Quran, the surahs, in Finnegan's Wake. So he says that basically until Finnegan's Wake was published, nobody could understand the Quran in translation. And he has a quote, Norman Brown, that I'll read. That he says, there's two types of social criticism alive in the world today: Marxism and Islam, two still revolutionary forces, two tired old horses. Neither of them are doing very well, but it would be a mistake to take any comfort from their failure. The human race is at stake, and they both, Marxism and Islam, agree on one proposition: there shall be one world or there shall be none. Now, as I mentioned, this itch at the back of the throat was what led us to kind of alphabet politics and the idea and the kind of the questions about transliteration, namely our third or fourth book called this one, which looks at language and namely the phoneme h as a kind of sacred phoneme across different alphabets. So in the Cyrillic alphabet, in the Arabic alphabet, in the Hebrew alphabet, the ch is a very important letter. This is the Arabic ch, Cyrillic ch, and chet in Hebrew. The word for life in Hebrew is chet. Ch in Arabic has a numerological value of 100, which is very important as well. And it's also we joke that it's an anti-imperialist phoneme because native English speakers have a really hard time pronouncing ch. I don't know, maybe you guys can try and sort of be the exception to the rule. But normally when you pronounce words, you have to push air through your throat, right? And ch is about the constriction of air through your throat. It's the opposite. So you're not actually pushing, you're stopping the passage of air through your throat. And even more difficult is the qaf, which is sort of, that's how you pronounce the Quran. It's kind of a glottal stop, almost like a glottal stop. Now, in Cyrillic, one of the people to kind of emphasize this value of the ch in the Russian alphabet is Khlebnikov. Khlebnikov was the anti-modernist poet, let's say, to Mayakovsky. Mayakovsky is like the jock, right, who embraced Bolshevism. Khlebnikov was the kind of grandfather inspiration to all the futurists. He died quite young, and he identified sort of 40-odd words in Slavic languages that start with ch, having to do with shelter. And as you know, whenever you're looking at kind of important etymological words, you're always looking at things like sun, basic words like sun, shelter, earth, as the kind of earliest words. And Khlebnikov was obsessed with this term, but because also he believed that it allowed for, Khlebnikov was basically obsessed with Russia looking eastward and not westward. So Russia looking to its kind of Turkic, Altaic, Finno-Ugric roots, its Persian roots, as opposed to kind of Russia's intellectual history, which has been to look westwards, like St. Petersburg, a kind of a window onto the West and European culture. And he had this really interesting theory where he believed that the order of letters actually had some meaning. So opposite of all the kind of structural linguistics that we're taught about, he believed that each letter had an agency. So he would say, he called it this kind of inner declension. So he would say that, for example, the fact that junk in Russian, kham, if you just change the L to the R, it kind of sublimates itself and becomes shrine, is not a coincidence. So this kind of spatial agency of each letter vis-a-vis another letter. And he also was kind of a pioneer in internal rhyming schemes. And this is, I'll read this to you in Russian. The English is actually quite well translated. We didn't do it. I wish we had translated it. But in English it reads, "Let us not be heads of lettuce. Let us not let knives upset us." And in Russian you'll see the kind of internal rhyming much better. It's nash kochin, ochin azabochin, noj atochin, tochin ochin. So in this kind of closer to home, one of the examples of one of the pioneers of this internal rhyming schemes in hip-hop was actually Notorious B.I.G., and which is one of the reasons why he was kind of became quite famous quite early. And I'll give you an example of that here.
We used to fuss when the landlord dissed us. No heat, wonder why Christmas missed us. Birthdays was the worst days. Now we sip champagne when we thirsty.
Now, Khlebnikov was also considered to be a kind of a Russian dervish. That's what people called him in Iran when he went down in 1920, 1921 to help the Soviets who established a kind of ersatz republic on the banks of the Caspian, the only Soviet socialist republic in Iran. It was very short-lived. And his sort of philosophy of poetry was called Zaum. Zaum means literally trans-rational. Za means trans, or beyond, and is kind of the rational or the mind. And we came across a translation of Zaum that was better. It was a little bit sexier than trans-rational, which sounds like a disease. And it was beyond sense. And we really love this term, beyond sense, because within beyond sense, you have nonsense. But I think Khlebnikov would have been very proud, because within beyond sense, you also have Beyonce. And he wouldn't have, I'm sure he would have considered that not a kind of a coincidence. But one of the people that Khlebnikov met was Mirza Kuchak Jangali, who was a leader of this short-lived socialist republic. And for our exhibition at the MoMA, called Beyond Sense, we recreated, you can't see it here actually. Well, the lighting that you're seeing that's green is coming from, we actually recreated a skylight from a Sufi mosque that was in downtown New York in Soho that was commissioned, that was made by Dan Flavin. And it's a really unknown Dan Flavin work, because in some ways I think that people who like Dan Flavin and Dan Flavin himself weren't comfortable with the idea that his work was being used in a mosque, because it was just like the kind of whole furor over building a mosque in Ground Zero a couple years ago, or 10 years ago already, because somehow there's something, I guess, karmically, you just can't build a mosque like below Houston in New York. People just go apeshit crazy. And the khus here are, all the three khus are kind of holding hands. This fountain here is I guess, an example of this metaphysical splits, in the sense that through this very simple idea of a red fountain, you would have children who would come into the space through here. And the child, for a child, the red fountain looks like Kool-Aid or kind of kompot, and would run towards the fountain. And the parents would often like grab the child and say, no, no, no, no. So this, because for adults, most of the time, this red fountain implies blood. And so in this very kind of very simple color, you have these two ends of a spectrum, which you often don't put together. This kind of very naive, childlike approach to the color, but also the idea of blood, or the political manipulation of violence that blood represents. Now, we first kind of fell in love with these devastating changes of alphabets in the translation of a famous political satire called Mullah Nasruddin, named after this figure. And this is a publication which was 1906, 1930, first in Tbilisi, then Baku. It was an Azhari publication, probably the most important periodical of the Muslim world of the 20th century. And it was super progressive for women's rights. Actually, Azerbaijan gave women the right to vote before, I think, any country in Europe did, in 1918. And very much against colonialism, and partially because it was so visually driven. It was basically 8 to 12 pages, of which the majority were illustrations, really incredible illustrations. This is, for example, an Azhari man with his Muslim wife, and the same man with his Russian lover on the right. So this kind of double standard of how you treat the Christian woman and how you treat the Muslim woman. Now, often people ask us, sort of, why are you looking at this area of the world? You know, why Eurasia? Why between the former Berlin Wall and the Great Wall of China? And this Mullah Nasruddin is for us perhaps the most sort of succinct answer to that. You would imagine that if we're on a kind of, if you believe all this nonsense which passes as wisdom today, that somehow the West and the East are on a collision course, or Islam has a problem with modernity, then you would imagine that the most important periodical of the Muslim world would have been translated 50 years ago or 60 years ago. And it wouldn't be up to artists in 2011 to translate it for the first time into English. It's not because we're incredible researchers and we found it in the corner of a library, a dusty library in Baku. It's available if you go to Baku, reissued like this. It's just that people who go to Baku usually are going for oil or for like Eurovision Song Contest. They don't actually go. So our region kind of falls through the cracks, right? It's not the Middle East, but it's largely Muslim. It's not Russia, but it's largely Russian-speaking. It has a very important relationship with China, but it's not under Chinese rule, except for a very small part, which we'll discuss later. So Mullah Nasruddin it really advocated also the beginning of Azhari language, which was revolutionary at the time, because Azhari was considered to be a dialect. Usually would publish in Istanbul Turkish or in Russian. And there's a lot of illustrations about cutting out Azhari's tongues and sort of sewing them a new Russian tongue, or students sort of telling their teachers, why do I need another tongue? I already have my own. but it's really on the pages of this publication that you see this schizophrenia of what happens when you change alphabets 3 times. Because the Soviets changed the alphabets of the Muslim subjects of the Russian Empire and then the early Soviet Union 3 times. You've heard of Turkey probably changing once in 1928 to Latin. Well, in the former Soviet Union, in the Soviet Union, in 1929 they changed it to Latin because Lenin believed the revolution of the East is to take all the Muslim subjects and get rid of the Arabic script. Once you get rid of the Arabic script, you force them to kind of come into what he believed to be modernity and let go of their Muslim past. Then in 1939, Stalin comes and says, actually, no. Let's change the alphabet, but let's keep writing from left to right, but let's do it in Cyrillic and not in Latin. So imagine like within 10 years being asked twice to take out all your books, burn them and start reading and writing in a different script. Same language, but different script. 91 comes around and again, let's change back to Latin. So what you have is you have the situation where 3 generations are immigrants in their own language, right? A grandmother, a son, and a granddaughter can all speak the same language but can't necessarily read the same book. And you see it within the pages of this magazine. Mullah Nasruddin in Arabic script, Mullah Nasruddin in Cyrillic, and then Latin here, or even Latin, you can see the Latin here, qaymati, meaning price. So 3 different alphabets, 1 language. And it kind of drove us crazy to an extent that we thought about changing the name of the Azhari language because finding a translator of any language to another language is relatively easy. What's difficult is finding somebody who reads and writes 3 iterations of that same language. So we thought about sort of changing the name of the language instead of Azhari to just calling it Azhari because it was actually so difficult. In the end, we just found the translator from Azhari to Russian, and we did the Russian to English translation. Now, Paul Ricoeur considers translation to be a form of linguistic hospitality, right? This Abrahamic idea that's shared amongst Jews, Muslims, and Christians, that you're inviting yourself into the language of the other, and that you're inviting the other into your language. And if that's the case, then transliteration is essentially language in drag. It's language putting on the clothes or the presentation of the other, or the other, in this case, another script. And an example of this is Bukhara, which is considered to be the 4th holiest place in Islam after Mecca, Medina, and Jerusalem. In Bukhara, you traditionally had, in present-day Uzbekistan, you traditionally had Jews living in Bukhara called Bukharan Jews. Bukharan Jews would read and write, they spoke Persian, meaning an Iranian language, but they did it in a Hebrew script. So again, this kind of collision of an alphabet and language you normally don't put together. I guess you guys are graduate students, so you don't have this kind of stupid college humor anymore, right? If you go to campuses all around the States, you'll see really very bad jokes like this on T-shirts. There's another version, of course, that says 2 beers or not 2 beers. And essentially what it is, it's taking a relatively important existential question, no matter how cliche it's become, and you see it on like The Simpsons, and it's bringing it down to a level of consumption, right? Like, should I drink a beer or should I not drink a beer? Or should I drink 2 beers or should I not drink 2 beers? So what we were thinking was, how can we rescue the kind of existential gravitas of this question and bring it back to a question of identity and belonging, right? Because if you, Valérie, drink a beer or not, I don't care. Go ahead. It makes no difference. But for a Muslim to drink a beer or not to drink a beer, it actually becomes, again, a question of identity and being. And you can do that by simply transliterating it into the Arabic script, right? So, to bir or not to bir, again, becomes a question of identity and belonging and subjectivity, like the original question of to be or not to be. So taqiyya is a form of dissimulation. Essentially what it is it's a kind of tenet in Shia Islam that allows you to pass, if you're being persecuted, to do things which normally you wouldn't be allowed to do. So for example, if you're being persecuted, you could theoretically drink alcohol. You could theoretically eat pork in order to escape this kind of oppression or suppression or oppression. and changing alphabets in some ways is a form of dissimulation of a language as well. What we thought was interesting is that, in fact, the Turkic-speaking world, this is the whole Turkic-speaking world, it extends probably up to there. In the whole Turkic-speaking world, the only people who still read and write in Arabic script, which is not the original, but let's say the longest duration of an alphabet in these languages, is not Turkey itself, of course, but the Uyghurs of Xinjiang. And the Uyghurs of Xinjiang, they're the only ones who still have an Arabic script, actually. So interestingly enough, in the mid-'80s, the Uyghurs' alphabet changed to Arabic at the same time, or shortly before, many of their co-ethnic, co-language group people across the borders here were about to become independent for the first time. And Uyghurs are Turkic people who live in the west of China. This is the only part of Central Asia that's historically under Chinese rule. And they have all the pictures of shrines that you've been seeing as kind of chapter headings. These are all Uyghur shrines that are Muslim shrines where people kind of go and pay their respects to saints or to people who are important in battle and bringing Islam to a traditionally Buddhist place or historically Buddhist place before that in the 13th century, 14th century. But also, they have a very elastic sense of identity in the sense that many of these shrines are named after Shia figures like Imam Ali, even though they're Sunni. And this is a very important sort of example of how syncretism, or even how the edges of empires, it's really at the edges of empires, at the edges of ideologies, that you find the most progressive elements of any faith, of any ideology. And it's never at the core. Often at the core, things are quite rotten. For those of you who are not familiar with sort of Shias are essentially, this is 12er Shiism. Shias are a minority of Islam, 20% minority of Islam. And Shias share one of the kind of the theories I like of the accusations that Sunni make against Shia is that Shias essentially re-Christianized Islam, right? The Shias in some ways reintroduced the idea of mystery into a faith. If you think about it, every faith comes as a kind of reform on the previous religion. In Islam, this idea of the unicity of God against icons was very important, but Shias reintroduced the 12 imams almost like saints. So it's almost like, I mean, this is uncanny. If you think about it, 12 imams, does that remind you of any other 12 people, right? 12 imams, of which the 12th is going to come back at the end of time, right? And on Judgment Day. And there's all kinds of parallels. I mean, Catholics, for example, have processional banners that they march out in sort of Catholic processions. Shias also have this during Muharram, where we beat ourselves in the back like self-flagellating Catholics. We also have passion plays called Taziyeh, which you had in Christianity in the Middle Times. I mean, all the way into like even painting behind glass, which is one of my favorite craft forms. This idea of painting behind glass, because painting behind glass is a kind of reverse of perspective, right? Is that you have to first start with the eyes and then paint backwards to the backdrop. And you find this amongst Catholics in sort of Italy and Romania, as well as Shias in Syria. You'll find this painting behind glass in Lebanon and in Iran as well. Now in 1928, Ataturk Latinized the Turkish alphabet. The official term is Romanization, this idea of changing to Latin script. And what I like about this idea of calling him a Romanizer is it rhymes with womanizer, and Ataturk was definitely a womanizer. I mean, they call him kind of old blue eyes. He had really very, very blue eyes for a Turk. And Ataturk did this for many reasons. You could argue, obviously there were ideological reasons to hitch Turkey's destiny onto the West, but also because Turkish has about 8 vowels, that Arabic only has 3. So how could you accommodate those vowels? For example, you've seen the vowels, I'm sure, like the ones that look German, the with the umlaut and the ü, right? There's no Arabic vowel, there's no Arabic letter for those 2 letters, for these sounds. And ü, there's no letter for this. But when you add letters, you're also losing certain letters, right? And you're losing certain sounds. And one of the sounds that the Turks lost was the Turks used to have 2 N's. One which is a normal N, which is like Nancy or never or Nottingham. Another N is an N which sounds like this. Try doing Now, other than sounding kind of like you're flirting or like or being flirted with, it's a nasal, right? And what's interesting about the is that for me it sounds very Asian in the sense that it's a surname, and amongst millions of Chinese across Southeast Asia and China itself, NG, right? And it's not a coincidence that Ataturk or that Turkey lost this letter in its attempt to be Western, right? There are certain parts of Turkey today which still have this a lot of these letters, a lot of these words you might know in Turkish, like the word for sea is deniz. It used to be dangiz, and this is almost lost. I think in Anatolia you still have some parts of it. It looked like this. It looked like a K. What's a K in Arabic? Kef with 3 dots over it. The Uyghurs still have this and we were quite interested in this idea. When we're doing research onto a given topic, we ask ourselves sort of what are we bringing to the table that linguists, scholars like yourselves haven't already brought, because it's not about reproducing or illustrating ideas of others, but about sort of thinking about things differently. And one of them is that is the different organs of speech. If you think about it, the nose is a kind of site of resistance, or the throat. Whenever we talk about language, we often use this metonymy of a tongue, right? Mother tongue. And when you think of the tongue, you think of this sort of Rolling Stones tongue, right? The one that's sort of sticking out. It looks great, looks like a lollipop, you want to lick it. But actually, all the organs of language, including the tongue, are extremely erogenous. The nose, the ears, the throat, the teeth, the lips. So there's a sensuality to it. But also, the tongue itself is really a fleshy and not a very attractive. I mean, next time, just ask your partner to lift their tongue up and look underneath somebody's tongue. It's really quite gross. It's sort of blue and green, pulsating with sort of saliva and blood vessels. So it's not this kind of clean, let's say, the linguist approach to language that was, let's say, a legacy of kind of a very clinical approach to language. And when we, for a recent series of carpets called Love Letter Carpets, we actually took Mayakovsky drawings. These are all Mayakovsky illustrations, and we reworked them to address language politics or alphabet politics. Now, alphabets accompany empires, right? Latin came with the rise of Christianity, Arabic came with the rise of Islam, and Cyrillic with the rise of the Orthodox faith, and then several centuries later, communism. But the reason we chose Mayakovsky was because he was the kind of poster child for the slippery, talismanic use of the tongue. He was a poet who embraced Bolshevism, so he kind of, through his tongue, he rose to the highest ranks of power, but also slipped to the extent that he committed suicide in 1929. So you have this kind of, this almost Greek tragic figure because of the way his tongue was used. And an example of these sort of the divide and conquer politics of alphabets is that when the Soviets, for example, changed all the Turkic people's alphabets, the Tajiks, the Turkmens, the Uzbeks, they would give different letters for the same sound. So this is all the sound. This is all the j, all different letters for one sound, one phoneme, and they did this because, of course, they didn't want them to be mutually intelligible. So the Turkmens and the Uzbeks and the Kazakhs and the Kyrgyz could not be ever kind of unite, let's say, and pose a threat to the central power. And we made a piece called The Nose Twister, where we wanted to kind of, again, do these splits, right, where the nose is hitting both the N and the in one go. And we took the nose of the wife of a very famous Azhari painter, Tahir Salahov. You might know him, Olga. And she's got a beautiful Turkic nose. And we took her nose and actually made a piece of furniture that's actually a kef doing the nose twister. So it's essentially trying to kind of reach for hit both of those notes. And you can sort of sit against it and enjoy. Now, what's interesting is when you change alphabets, we came across one scholar's article, İlker Ayturk in Ankara. He did a really interesting study. He said, look, there's a kind of criterion for languages when they want to switch alphabets. And one of them is that he looks at the Jews and says, Hebrew, right? Hebrew was reinstated in the late 19th, early 20th century. It didn't exist as a written language, other than liturgy, other than scripture. It didn't exist as a transactional language for almost, I guess, 1,000 years, if not more. And so the early Zionists, they were all from Europe. And there was a question of maybe just doing Hebrew in Latin. Why do Hebrew in the square alphabet that we know? Why not just do it in the Latin alphabet, since most of the people who were advocating it came from Hungary, Poland, or Germany. And he comes up with a kind of interesting criteria, and he says that if you want to change your scripts, first of all, you have to have an inferiority complex vis-a-vis the script you're changing to, right? Which the Turks, of course, had it vis-a-vis Europe, but the Jews didn't have vis-a-vis Europe in there. And another thing he mentions is that you have to have a relatively low percentage of literacy. So the Turks had about 5 or 6% literacy, which is easy to do because then you don't have that much to change, let's say. Whereas the Jews of Europe, they were the Zionists, and the Sephardids actually had a much higher percentage of literacy. Now, one of these examples of sort of disrespecting and respecting your sources that language changes implies is a phenomenon called Gabrielle Off Technique. So the first time I was in Russia in 1996, when I was studying there, I went to see a Pasolini film, and I'd never seen a Pasolini film. I had no idea what I was in for. On top of it, there was one person throughout the whole screening translating and basically not changing her tone and doing all the script, all the languages, man or woman, all the roles, everybody like this just continued for 2 hours. She never took a breath. She just continued the whole time under the script, live translation. And they didn't turn off the Italian. So I was blasting Italian in one ear, blasting Russian in the other, and I understood nothing. I was like, wow, this is quite conceptual, you know, like this is like idiot savant performance art. And I didn't realize, of course, that it was a technique called Gabrielle Off Technique, or live voiceover translation. To this day, on Russian TV or Polish TV, you actually have this same thing. So it's a very interesting phenomenon. What it is it's a kind of poor man's dubbing originally. It's much cheaper than dubbing, but it's much richer as well. It's because Poles and Russians they want to hear the voice of the original actors, right? So they want to hear Eddie Murphy in Beverly Hills Cop, but they want to understand him as well. So they don't want to choose between understanding him and hearing him. They want to have both. And it's interesting because it's kind of disrespectful to speak over somebody, right? Because usually if you wait for somebody to be translated, so you kind of one person speaks, and the next person translates, and then one person speaks, and you translate. This is speaking over them. It's disrespectful, but at the same time, it's respectful because you're making an effort for them to be understood. And I can just show you an example of this, which is a scene, a kind of cult scene from Pulp Fiction, so you'll know most of the dialogue.
Myślałem, że to Europejczyk. Taki z niego Europejczyk jak z ziela angielskiego. Ale był w porządku, absolutnie. Wszystko pod kontrolą. Nawet się nie wkurwił, jak się stawiałeś. Aż się zdziwiłem. Chcesz bekon? Nie jem wieprzowiny. Jesteś Żydem? Nie jestem Żydem, ale nie podchodzą mi świnie. Dlaczego? Bo są obmierzłe. Nie jem takich zwierząt. Bekon jest pyszny. Kotlety są pyszne. Może i szczur smakuje jak ptyś. Nie wiem, bo i tak nie zjadłbym skurwiela. Świnie śpią i ryją we własnym gównie, dlatego są obmierzłe. Nie wezmę do ust niczego, co lubi własne odchody. A psy? Psy zjadają własne gówno. Psów też nie jadam. Ale uważasz, że psy są obmierzłe?
So I'll end with a quote by Marshall McLuhan. He talks about the Greek myth of Cadmus. Cadmus, reputedly the king who introduced the phonetic letters into Greece, sowed the dragon's teeth, and they sprang up as armed men. Languages are filled with the testimony to the grasping, devouring power and precision of teeth. That the power of letters as agents of aggressive order and precision should be expressed as extensions of the dragon's teeth is natural and fitting. Letters are not only like teeth visually, but their power to put teeth into the business of empire building is manifest in our Western history. Thank you very much for coming.